I always believed courtrooms smelled like war, not of gunpowder or blood, but of tension so sharp it left a metallic taste on the tongue. I lived in that arena for over 2 decades, walking into battles where billions of dollars, reputations, and sometimes entire industries hung on the next sentence I spoke. 50 times I walked out victorious. 50 times the enemy folded. And yet, the war didn't end in a courtroom. It ended in a boardroom, across a polished oak table, with a smile from someone young enough to be my daughter. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 58 years old, and until recently, I was Chief Litigation Counsel for Hawthorne Dynamics, a multinational technology firm that liked to boast its lawyers were as sharp as its engineers. For 30 years, I sharpened myself there. I fought against hostile takeovers, dismantled frivolous class actions, and protected patents worth more than gold mines. I built my reputation case by case, word by word, until my name meant victory to shareholders and fear to opponents. I thought that counted for something. But last month, they crowned a new CEO. Her name is Evelyn Cross, 25, Ivy League degree, charisma, polished like glass. The daughter of a major investor, parachuted into the top job as though leadership were a birthright. She called me into her office 3 days after taking over. The place still smelled like fresh paint, as though she had erased every trace of the man who sat there before. She didn't waste time. "Daniel," she said, her tone clipped, efficient. "You've had an impressive run, no one disputes that. But your style, it's too rigid, too old-fashioned. We need voices that understand modern innovation, not the tired frameworks of yesterday." She smiled then, like she was offering me a compliment instead of a blade to the throat. I didn't speak. I'd heard verdicts before. I knew what was coming. "You're being replaced," she continued, effective immediately. "We're bringing in someone who sees the law as fluid, adaptable, someone less obsessed with precedent." And that's when the final insult landed. She wasn't replacing me with a partner from another firm, or some young prodigy with courtroom scars of their own. She was replacing me with her yoga instructor, a man whose only experience with legal documents was probably signing a lease for his studio. She introduced him with a flourish, as if unveiling a revolutionary weapon. "This is Jalen. He believes common sense is overrated, and I believe his outside perspective is exactly what we need." I should have laughed, should have stormed out, slammed the door, called her bluff, but I didn't. Instead, I smiled. A small, tired smile, the kind you wear when you already know the game is lost, before the referee blows the whistle. I thanked her for her time, turned, and walked out. My briefcase clicked shut like a coffin lid. As I walked down the hall, memories pressed against me. Nights in dim offices with stacks of depositions taller than my desk lamp. Early mornings rehearsing cross-examinations until my voice cracked. Victories where clients wept and clasped my hands like I'd saved their lives. And I had, in a way. I saved livelihoods, fortunes, futures. I thought those things mattered. I thought they would buy me loyalty. But loyalty, I learned, doesn't compound. It depreciates. I left the building quietly, past secretaries who didn't meet my eyes, past interns who whispered that Mercer was finally gone. Out on the street, the city kept moving, indifferent. Cabs honked, pedestrians jostled, stock tickers scrolled neon across glass towers. For everyone else, it was just another Thursday. For me, it was the first day of exile. But exile isn't the same as defeat. Defeat is final. Exile is waiting. I didn't tell Evelyn that I kept a copy of every case I ever won. Every deposition, every confidential memo, every smoking gun I'd unearthed to bury an opponent. I didn't tell her that knowledge doesn't retire. It lingers, sharp and patient. And I certainly didn't tell her that one day, someone would regret underestimating me. I just kept walking, the weight of my briefcase steady in my hand, like a reminder that the past never truly lets go. Retirement looks different when you don't believe in endings. People assume that when a man leaves his career behind, he buys a boat or a cabin, maybe starts golfing to distract himself from irrelevance. I chose something else. My sanctuary is a converted basement, walls lined with cabinets, stuffed full of case files stretching back 30 years. Every deposition, every ruling, every confidential exhibit I'd ever touched was preserved, cataloged, cross-referenced. At the center sits a heavy oak desk, stacked with monitors tied to subscription services, public records databases, and discrete feeds I never disconnected. I didn't build a tomb. I built a control room. From the outside, I looked retired. Neighbors saw me water plants in the morning, collect the paper, sip coffee on the porch. They thought I had finally slowed down. But beneath their line of sight, I sat surrounded by decades of victories and the tools to wage new ones. It wasn't nostalgia that kept me there. It was instinct. A strategist doesn't hang up his mind just because someone calls him obsolete. 3 days after Evelyn Cross stripped me of my title, whispers reached my ear. Old colleagues, reporters, even a clerk I'd once mentored. They all carried the same rumor in fragments. Hawthorne Dynamics was about to be hit with a lawsuit, not a nuisance claim, not another class action built to be settled quietly. This was heavier, federal level. A strike aimed at the company's foundation, the kind of thing that could drain its stock price by half in a single week. Evelyn had no idea what was barreling toward her. She was too busy staging press photos and tweeting slogans. I leaned back in my chair, letting the information settle. I could almost picture her smirk, the certainty that she had cleaned house by getting rid of me. She probably thought her yoga instructor turned legal savant was preparing airtight defenses while sipping green juice. Instead, he was filing sloppy motions riddled with errors. I didn't have to guess. I checked the docket myself. Wrong citations, precedent twisted until it snapped, arguments that would be laughed out of chambers by any half-awake judge. It was malpractice disguised as innovation. The arrogance wasn't surprising. I'd heard through back channels that Jalen, the so-called chief legal innovator, had boasted in a meeting that common sense is overrated. He mocked attorneys who wasted their lives memorizing rules and procedures, called us dinosaurs choking on dusty books. What he didn't understand, and what Evelyn refused to see, was that those dusty books had built walls strong enough to protect their empire for decades. Watching them stumble was almost painful. Almost. I had no joy in seeing the company weaken, because a strategist always remembers the larger field. One mistake spreads like rot, inviting predators who were waiting for a crack in the walls. And Hawthorne Dynamics, under Evelyn's shiny leadership, was splitting open faster than even I predicted. The sight dragged me backward to my first trial. I was 30, nervous enough to sweat through my shirt. The opposing counsel had fumbled, left a weakness wide open. All I had to do was strike. But I hesitated. Some part of me doubted my instinct, worried I'd misread the opportunity. In that single pause, he recovered, patched the hole, and nearly turned the tide. I still won, but by inches, and I carried the weight of that hesitation for years. Never again. Silence, I learned, is a weapon. If you let someone speak long enough, they'll reveal every flaw. If you let someone lead unchecked, they'll march themselves into ruin. So I didn't move yet. I watched, I recorded, I traced every filing Jalen made, noted every inconsistency, every arrogant phrase Evelyn delivered to shareholders. She believed her words inspired confidence. To me, they sounded like the rattling of a ladder, just before it tips. Patience is harder than action. It demands restraint, demands faith that time will sharpen the blade sharper than fury ever could. And so I stayed in my control room, drinking bitter coffee and marking the days. Evelyn thought she'd erased me with a signature on a termination letter. She didn't know I was already writing her ending. Every plan begins with silence. Not retreat, not surrender. Just the quiet hum of observation before the strike. In the days that followed the first whispers of Hawthorne's trouble, I started making calls. Old numbers I hadn't dialed in years still worked. A reporter from the Tribune who once shadowed me through a high-profile antitrust trial. A compliance officer at the SEC who owed me a favor for steering him away from a career-ending scandal. Even a partner at a rival firm I'd beaten so badly in court that he now respected me more than he hated me. None of these conversations were long. I didn't need to explain myself. I just asked questions, nudged them toward public records, hinted at stories waiting to be told. The seeds went into the soil without anyone realizing I was the one planting them. Meanwhile, Evelyn preened in the spotlight. She wanted the world to see her as the face of Hawthorne's new era. I watched from my control room as she strutted across business channels, delivering lines rehearsed for effect. She called herself a disruptor, praised her yoga instructor legal prodigy as the embodiment of bold thinking. It was theater, and she was the star, grinning wide while the stage beneath her feet quietly cracked. I didn't move to stop her. I wanted the cracks to spread. The shareholder meeting was my favorite performance, broadcast live no less. She stood at the podium in a pristine suit, radiating confidence. When a question about litigation risk came from an older shareholder, her smile sharpened into a blade. We're not chained to the outdated legal mindset that strangled innovation for decades, she said. Then she laughed lightly. Daniel Mercer was a dinosaur who thought laws mattered more than vision. We've evolved past that. The audience chuckled along, eager to believe youth meant progress. My phone buzzed within minutes, friends sending me the clip, some angry, some amused. I didn't answer. I just watched the playback. Her words weren't an insult. They were gasoline. Corporate law is nothing like the movies. It isn't about heroic speeches or sudden verdicts. It's trench warfare. You dig deep. You hold the line. You let the other side waste their strength charging blind. Patience bleeds them faster than bullets. Evelyn thought she'd won because she had a microphone. I knew better. The longer she talked, the deeper she buried herself. I thought about my father then. A factory worker, strong as steel, until management decided strength wasn't efficient anymore. They told him he was too old, replaced him with younger men willing to work for half the wage. I watched him walk out of the gates carrying a cardboard box of tools he'd spent 30 years perfecting. He never recovered. The humiliation hollowed him, made him bitter, until the day he died. I carried that image into every courtroom, every negotiation, every late night over legal briefs. I swore no one would ever discard me so easily. When Evelyn smiled and called me obsolete, she wasn't just speaking to me. She was speaking to the boy who stood by a chain-link fence, watching his father's life dissolve. That boy had been waiting decades for this. So I stayed quiet. I let Evelyn pose, let Jalen file his disastrous motions, let shareholders clap politely, while muttering doubts into their whiskey afterward. I kept pulling threads, financial disclosures, contracts signed too quickly, side deals buried in footnotes. And then, in the middle of a forgotten folder, I found it. A skeleton. Not a rumor, not a whisper, but a documented trail tying Evelyn to a conflict of interest so poisonous it could unravel everything she had built her image on. The urge to reveal it immediately pressed against me like a blade in the ribs. One leak, one call, and her empire would topple overnight. But trench warfare teaches restraint. Timing wins wars, not fury. I closed the file, slid it into the drawer marked Endgame, and leaned back in my chair. Evelyn thought she was safe because she fired me. She didn't know I was the one deciding when her story would end. The first headline hit like a thunderclap. Hawthorne Dynamics faces federal probe amid allegations of securities fraud. Within hours, every business outlet had picked it up. Commentators dissected it from every angle, speculating on fines, prison terms, and whether the company could survive the blow. Investors panicked. The stock plummeted 12% in a single day, wiping billions off the market cap. And while the world gasped, I sat in my basement control room, sipping cold coffee, watching it unfold like a play I'd seen rehearsed 100 times. Evelyn Cross tried to project calm, but the cracks spread faster than she could patch them. She issued statements blaming external agitators, rogue accountants, even a coordinated smear campaign by legacy competitors. None of it stuck. The regulators had teeth, and the lawsuit was public record now. Every mistake her yoga instructor turned lawyer filed in court became another nail in the coffin. Shareholders started to whisper doubts in places she couldn't control. The boardrooms that once applauded her vision now echoed with suspicion. Then came the clip. Jalen, the man she had crowned chief legal innovator, stood outside a courthouse answering questions he wasn't qualified to answer. A reporter pressed him on why Hawthorne had ignored established precedent in their filings. He smiled, calm as a man teaching a stretching class, and said, "Common sense is overrated." The words slipped out like a joke, but they detonated across the internet. Anchors replayed the soundbite on loop. Investors groaned. Comedians mocked him on late-night television. Within 24 hours, the phrase had become synonymous with arrogance and incompetence. The stock nosedived another 10%. I should have been furious at their recklessness, but I wasn't. I let the fire burn hotter. Every collapse needs oxygen, and Evelyn supplied it with every panicked move she made. She held emergency press conferences, where her tone swung from icy control to barely concealed rage. She fired mid-level managers, reshuffled departments, blamed anyone within reach. Each action revealed weakness. Each word widened the target painted on her back. And I just waited. One evening, as the lawsuit tore through the headlines and Hawthorne's name curdled in the mouths of analysts, my phone rang. The caller ID froze me for only a moment. Evelyn Cross. I let it buzz until it stopped. 5 minutes later, it rang again. This time I muted it. She was desperate, and desperation is the most dangerous kind of invitation. If I had answered, she would have begged, bargained, maybe even promised me a throne to return. But betrayal doesn't heal with promises. It only festers. Betrayal never comes from strangers. A rival can't wound you the way someone close does. It takes familiarity, trust, even affection, to twist the knife in deep enough to scar. Evelyn had leaned on my victories, used my reputation as a shield, then tossed me aside as though 30 years were just dust on her shoes. That wasn't business, that was personal. And so, when her name flashed on my screen, I let it fade into silence. That silence was my answer. The days stretched into a pressure cooker. Lawsuits multiplied. Regulators announced hearings. Hawthorne's stock slid past, a point analysts once swore was impossible. Employees leaked stories of chaos inside the walls, shredded documents, frantic meetings, Evelyn shouting until her voice cracked. The company was breaking, and so was she. I kept my hands off the lever, knowing the weight of inevitability pressed down harder than anything I could add. But patience has its limit. A strategist doesn't just watch the enemy collapse. He chooses the moment to finish it. I had the file ready, the skeleton I'd uncovered buried deep in her past dealings. It sat on my desk like a blade, waiting to be drawn. The decision wasn't whether to use it. The decision was when. And then I knew. Tomorrow. Tomorrow the gavel would fall. And this time, I would be the one holding it. Timing is everything. Wars aren't won by the strongest army, but by the commander who chooses the moment of impact with precision. I had been waiting for mine, letting Evelyn burn herself alive under the lights of her own arrogance. When the lawsuit reached its peak, headlines blaring, investors revolting, regulators circling like vultures, I released the evidence. Not to one outlet, but to 5. Reporters I trusted, regulators I had cultivated, even rivals who would savor the kill. The file was meticulous. Financial statements doctored to hide losses, personal expenses disguised as company research, nepotistic contracts funneled to family shell companies. I had documented every line, cross-referenced every dollar, annotated every signature. There was no gray area. It was fraud, pure and undeniable. The story detonated like a bomb. Overnight, Evelyn Cross was no longer the bold young visionary shaking up Hawthorne dynamics. She was a liar, a thief, a fraud. Networks rolled footage of her smiling confidently at that shareholder meeting, mocking me as a dinosaur, then cut to the cold details of her embezzlement. Her grin looked grotesque in the new context, a mask stripped bare under the weight of truth. Investors abandoned ship, her allies distanced themselves, and regulators sharpened their knives. I watched the trial unfold from the gallery, quiet and steady, the way a man watches a chess match when he already knows the outcome. Evelyn sat at the defense table, the same confidence she once wielded now cracking into desperate denial. She tried charm, she tried indignation, she tried silence. None of it mattered. The evidence was too heavy. And when the prosecutor began cross-examining her, I leaned forward just enough to hear every word. "Miss Cross, can you explain why company funds were transferred into a private account under your father's name?" Her lips moved, but the answers collapsed under the weight of documents projected on the screen. "Can you clarify why contracts were awarded to entities with no employees, no history, and mailing addresses matching your personal residence?" Each question was another nail, each exhibit another hammer. I had taught her once about precedent and due diligence. She had nodded then, eager to impress, repeating my lessons back to me as if she understood. Now, those same principles carved her open. Precedent meant every prior conviction mirrored her future. Due diligence meant her failure to act wasn't carelessness, it was intent. The very tools she mocked now pinned her to the wall. Jalen, the yoga instructor lawyer, barely lasted a week in the storm. When regulators investigated his qualifications, the farce collapsed. His license application hadn't cleared. His role was a fraud, built on her arrogance. He fled quietly, muttering to reporters that he'd been misled. By the time the dust settled, he was a national punchline and permanently disbarred before he'd ever been admitted. Evelyn had destroyed him as thoroughly as she destroyed herself. The verdict came swift. Guilty on counts of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The board stripped her of title. Shareholders stripped her of trust. and the court stripped her of freedom. She was led out in cuffs. Chin lifted like pride could still cover shame. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. The gavel had already fallen in my mind the moment I slid that file into the world. She thought she fired me. But in truth, I fired her from the human race. When the courtroom emptied, I stayed behind for a while, staring at the seal above the judge's bench. Betrayal, I realized, is never exotic. It's as old as humanity itself. Every generation believes the old are relics, that experience is weakness, that tradition is a cage, and every generation learns too late that the truths of the past are the sharpest weapons. Evelyn believed my time had passed. She didn't see that time was the only ally I needed. Revenge isn't rage. Rage burns out too fast. Revenge is patience sharpened into inevitability, a blade honed by silence until it cuts clean. They called me obsolete. But what's obsolete to them is eternal to me. The law doesn't age, it waits. The bailiff turned the lights low, and I walked out into the corridor, the echoes of the gavel still ringing in my ears. The case was closed, her power extinguished, my silence finally spoken through action. There would be no sequel, no resurrection. Evelyn Cross was finished. And as I stepped into the daylight, I knew that nothing more needed to be said. The gavel had fallen. Forever.